Hello, everyone. If you want to just bear with us for a second, I'm waiting for Pete to hop on so I can send him a quick invite, and then we will go ahead and get started. This is our first Instagram Live, so please bear with us with any technical issues that hopefully we won't experience, but you never know. Unfortunately, Rebecca's not going to be joining us today. She had a family emergency, so she wasn't able to make this. She was really looking forward to it, and she hopes that she's going to be able to join in one of the ones coming up. But we're keeping her and her family in our thoughts. Let me see if Pete is on here yet. Alrighty.
Hey, Ben.
Hey, how's it going?
Good. How are you?
I'm good. So thanks again for coming, everyone. Just a quick introduction. My name is Ben Laguidis, and I am the hatchery technician at the Billy and Oyster Project. I've been working here since January, and prior to that, I was working in hydroponics, and then before that, I was working in commercial aquaculture doing oyster farming. I went to Roger Williams University and studied marine biology. Rebecca and I actually went to the same college and had a couple of classes together. So,
And I guess it's my turn to introduce myself. So I'm Pete Malinowski. I'm the executive director of Billy and Oyster Project. And for today, I will be Rebecca Resner. So just imagine that I am her for this video.
alrighty. So we can jump right into the questions. So Pete, somebody from the audience wrote in these questions. The first one we're going to talk about is, how do you breed oysters? Do you use harbor water for it? And how do you stimulate the oysters to reproduce?
Oh, really getting right into the nitty gritty off the bat. So, we try when we can to use local oysters for our brood stock. Brood stock is a term we use for the parent oysters, the moms and dads of the next generation. And so we select those brood stock based on characteristics that we want passed down to the next generation. So we look for oysters that have been successful in New York Harbor when we can. They come into the lab and we trick them into thinking it's springtime out of season. And we do that by warming up the water temperature gradually over the period of several days, and then holding them at that warm temperature. Feed them lots of food. The oysters think it's springtime, and oysters naturally during the spring and summer prepare to spawn. So they'll produce, up to a third of their soft tissue mass will become either eggs or sperm, and they'll be ready to spawn. And then when they're all ready to spawn, we dim the lights in the hatchery, play some mute music, and then we'll actually use temperature stimulation. So by increasing and decreasing the temperature by a couple degrees at a time, that usually stimulates them to spawn. And if that doesn't work, then you can grind up the meat from one of the oysters and feed it to all the other ones. And that the presence of gametes in the water stimulates the oysters to spawn. For all this, we use harbor water when we can. And that water is filtered down to 1 micron. A micron is 1/1000th of a millimeter. So we take out all the solids from the water, treat it with UV light, and then to get any live organisms out, and then bring it through the oysters. But we try to use harbor water. I think that was all the questions. I don't remember. Is there one more that I missed?
No, I think you nailed all three.
Okay. So Ben, one of the questions is, how are shells the only substrate that oysters can attach to?
So oysters definitely prefer to grow on a calcium-based substrate like other shells, which is why at the Billy and Oyster Project, we collect shells, be it oyster shells or clam shells or scallop shells, from a bunch of restaurants. And we use that as the setting substrate in our hatchery. So for those of you who don't know, oysters actually start out as a swimming larvae. So they swim around until they find something that they can glue themselves to, and that's where they'll spend the rest of their lives. In the wild, a lot of times that is other colonies of oysters, but you can also find them on rocks. If you ever go down to the beach and you go to a jetty, you'll see oysters kind of growing in that intertidal zone. They'll grow on wooden piers, and you can even find them growing on like plastic waste that is in the ocean and ceramic waste, and they'll really stick to anything they can, but they definitely prefer to grow onto the other oyster shells, and they form like cool little colonies. So Pete, how do students help spawn oysters?
That's a great question, and it's really fundamental to the work that we do at Billy and Oyster Project. We try to have students integrated throughout as much of the work as we do. A big part of our mission is using oyster restoration as a teaching tool to not only get new generation of New Yorkers excited about the natural resource and informed about how they can play a role in making it better. But also, we believe that the outcomes for the natural world and the outcomes for public school students are best improved if those students are working to improve the natural resource. And so on the aquaculture side, students are involved throughout the process. They're cleaning brood stock, preparing them to spawn, checking the development of the gonads throughout that process, and then actually when the spawning happens, doing the work, checking water temperature, making sure that all the oysters are eating, watching them for signs of spawning, and then separating them as males and females, so that we can collect the egg and sperm. And then so the aquaculture class is directly involved, and then there's also an internship program where students meet after school and over the summer to do the same thing. So Ben, how long does it take for oysters to go from larvae to harvesting? Another question from the group.
So at Billion Oyster Project, we don't actually harvest the oysters once they get to adult size. That's kind of our whole shtick, is that we want more oysters in the wild. So the ones we put out there, once they get to maturation, we're hoping that they continue to reproduce and keep growing wild oysters. But in the commercial sense, it takes about 18 to 24 months for them to get there. So this is after that, after they've set, once they've become what's known as seed, which is like just little, really small baby oysters. It takes usually 1.5 to 2 years, but that all depends on where the oyster is, the quality of the water, the amount of food that's in the water, and then just the oyster themselves. You have to kind of think of it as it is a living animal. So think of it like, if you have a sibling, you guys didn't grow at exactly the same rate. So not all oysters are going to grow right at the same rate. Once they hit that market size is usually around 3 inches. That's what's preferred for your oyster on the half shell. The bigger oysters you can still eat them, but typically you'll see those kind of chopped up, or maybe oyster Rockefeller. They're not so good when you're just slurping a big 4.5, 5-inch oyster out of the shell. So Pete, somebody else asked, what is your average stocking density for 6 to 8 day old larvae? And this was actually from another oyster farm.
Yeah, it feels like a setup. I just want to give a quick shout out to Fanola, who I saw join. Hi, Fanola. And Nate Dudley, founding principal of Harbor School. Good to see you, man. Happy to have you here. So 6 to 8 day old larvae. What we do is we have 1,600 liter conicals, which is roughly 400 gallons, and we stock them initially with 5 million oysters in the hopes of getting, after that grading process, getting about 500,000 out of each tank. So 6 to 8 day old larvae is kind of in the middle of that, and so each of those tanks will have between 2 and 2.5 million oysters in it, if everything's going perfectly, which of course it never does. So Ben, how do oysters filter water, and do the oysters remove heavy metals from the water?
All right, so I guess we'll break this question down a little bit. To start off, oysters filter water because that's how they get fresh oxygen and food into their systems. So they're not helping us on purpose. It's just kind of they've adapted to pull other things out of the water. So all of the water that the oysters bring through their body is filtered through their gills. And they have these tiny little hair-like structures that just beat, called cilia. Just imagine going like that, and that's what's pulling the waters in. So those cilia beat and they pull in anything that's in the water, including plankton and microalgae. And that stuff that the oysters can use as food will get stuck in a mucus layer in the gills and then eventually brought to the stomach, where it's digested and then excreted. But other things are also brought into the oysters when it's filtering. So one of the big reasons that oysters help clean waterways and help filter those waterways is because they can remove excess nitrogen in the water. So excess nitrogen usually comes from runoff, be it pollution or fertilizer, whatever else. But having a ton of nitrogen in the water helps stimulate algae growth too much. And when there's too much algae, it actually counteracts, which decreases the oxygen levels, and it makes it just a bad kind of inhabitable area known as a dead zone. So by pulling that excess nitrogen out, the oysters will take it into their tissues or use it in their cells or in their shells. And if there's too much, they'll actually be excreted in like little mucus packages with the rest of its feces or pseudo-feces. It will fall to the sediment where the algae can't use it. And then other detritivores or animals or bacteria that eat dead things can use it in that fashion. When we're talking about heavy metals, oysters are not a super efficient way to remove heavy metals from the water. They do take some heavy metals out, and it is incorporated into their tissue and into their shells, but they're not like this great filter that will just get rid of all the lead and all the calcium and all the zinc. One thing that is really cool is that oysters are a great indicator of what's in the water. So if you do tests on the oyster meat or on the oyster shells, you can usually say that, pretty definitively that if the oyster tissue has a lot of copper in it, then there's probably a lot of excess copper in the water. But no, they don't pull out a ton of heavy metals, but they do help filter other not so great things like that excess nitrogen from the water. So Pete, what type of food do you feed the larvae?
Hi, Jerry. Sorry, I'm distracted by the feed here. So what kind of food? Oysters are just like people. They like to have a varied diet. So we mix it up. They all eat phytoplankton. Phytoplankton are unicellular photosynthetic organisms that are a lot like plants, but they're actually protists like other seaweed. You think of the difference between plants and protists as plants all have veins, so they need a system of moving water through their bodies, whereas protists are in the water, so they don't need that vascular system. But we grow 5 species of phytoplankton. Each of those species provides different aspects of the nutritional requirements that oysters need, and they're also different sizes. So very young oysters can only eat, the smallest phytoplankton, whereas larger oysters can eat the whole variety. So if you're interested in the name of the algae we grow Isochrysis, Pavlova, Catoceras, Thalassiosira, and Tetraselmis. It's been a while since I said all 5 of those. And so the younger oysters can only eat the smaller organisms, whereas the larger oysters can eat the whole range. And then now I have to ask Ben a question. Okay. So, what New York, hi Willis, what New York Harbor species are threats to oysters, Ben?
All right. So there are a lot of natural predators to oysters in the New York Harbor. Like you have things like oyster drills, oyster toadfish, blue crabs, whelks, lobsters, other fish, occasionally birds. Those are all non-invasive and native species to the harbor. So sure, they can threaten the individual oyster because, the oyster is its prey and that's what they eat. But we don't think of them as like a threat to our goal in building them back up. We don't want to kill or remove any of those species because they're all in the food chain. It is, it's still a natural food chain. So by taking any of those other things out, you could disrupt other areas in the food chain because all of those animals I listed are, prey for other things. There are also some non-predatory things that that can kill oysters. So one of the best examples that, we see, and if anyone here has ORS, you'll probably see on your ORS, are these sponges called boring sponges. They will actually use kind of this acidic solution to drill holes into the oyster shells, which will eventually kill the oyster. But the boring sponge, all it's doing is using that shell as kind of a foothold. So it makes the shell its home. It doesn't eat the oyster, but what it does by drilling holes is kill the oyster that's inside the shell, and then it just kind of makes its own little home there. Pete, somebody asked, what amount of time do you move oyster larvae to a tank and then to New York Harbor?
Good question. So during the spawning process, you separate the males and the females, the broodstock, and you collect all the eggs. The eggs are much more valuable than sperm, not surprisingly. And so once you have all the eggs in a bucket of water, you inoculate that with a small volume of sperm from the male oysters, and then you actually watch them under the microscope, and you can see the moment that those eggs are fertilized because they start to divide. And once you have a fertilization rate that's acceptable, high 80s, 90%, then you can pour the whole bucket into a tank. So it's really only a matter of 20, 30 minutes or an hour before between spawning and adding those larvae to the tanks. The larvae cycle takes anywhere from 10 days to 3 weeks, depending on how everything's growing. And once the larvae develop to a point where they're ready to go through metamorphosis, fall out of the water column and attach to a shell, they'll be added to a setting tank. So a larger tank filled with shell or other substrate. And then the larvae attach to the shells. And then shortly after that, in a few days or a week, they're ready to be transferred into to one of our reef sites. Ooh, this is a good one, Ben. Is the water getting cleaner with people on lockdown?
I just want to say I appreciate the haircut compliment. I did it myself, and I'm really proud of how it came out. So thank you for noticing. Is the water getting cleaner with people on lockdown? So this question's a bit tricky, and I know we've been asked a couple of times, so I'll do my best. Pete, if you have anything to say, please feel free to chime in. I know we've all seen the same headlines. The big ones are like the peaks of the Himalayas can be seen for the first time in decades, or, you know, dolphins are back in the canals in Venice, and that's all like really good news. And it's all, you know, if that stuff is true, it's all very easy to see with the naked eye. One of the differences with New York Harbor is we're not, you know, looking out our window and seeing whales and, you know, dolphins and everything come back into the harbor just like that. That's not how it happens. Because we're all locked down in isolation just like everyone else, nobody's really able to go out and do the research on the water and do the proper tests to definitively say that, okay, the harbor is, you know, this much healthier than it was. So we don't really know. We're only a month into it, so I also think it's too soon to say that, you know, this is helping this much or this little, but I definitely don't think less boats in the harbor is hurting it. Pete, do you have anything else to say there?
Yeah, I mean, what I would say is that it's easy when we're all stuck inside to forget about the, you know, natural resources where we live and get sort of, you know, in quarantine mode or stay at home mode. But I do strongly encourage everybody you know, when you're safely taking your social distance walks to get down to the water, because the harbor is empty and it's a really cool time to be on or near the water, and it's certainly one of the few places in New York where you can get very far away from other people. So I've been enjoying just you know, even just looking out over the harbor. And I have a red-tailed hawk that hangs out in my backyard sometimes. I have noticed that he's around a lot more lately. It might be just because I'm stuck at home, but I've seen a lot more of him. So hopefully, you know, someone's benefiting from us all staying inside.
Well, that was our list of questions. So, yeah, thank you everyone for joining. We're definitely looking forward to doing more of these in the future. Thank you all for those of you guys who submitted questions prior to, and Pete, thank you for stepping up last minute. And I also want to thank Helene for setting this all up. So yeah, any final words?
No, thanks everybody for joining. Just saw some late arrivers, Joe Ward and Ira. Nice to see you guys. Yeah, hopefully we'll do some more of this soon, and appreciate you all joining. Thanks a lot.
All right, take care, everyone.